Alright guys, so this is a speedrun of Link's Awakening DX reverse boss order. So basically the idea behind reverse boss order is you fight the bosses in reverse chronological, or reverse intended order rather. So the first boss we have to fight and defeat is Deathel, which is the final boss of the game. And the last boss we are required to defeat is Moldorm, which is the boss of Dungeon 1. And then afterwards we have to reach the end screen of the game by any means possible, which unfortunately the fastest way to do so is to actually just fight Deathel again. Well, that's the only way to do so in this category at least. There are a couple of restrictions in place, one being that wrong warping is banned, and the reason for this is it keeps the category a lot more interesting since the wrong warping is an incredibly broken trick, especially for a category like reverse boss order. So far, the game is pretty much the same as you would expect from most speedruns. Getting the sword is pretty straightforward, and there's not really anything you can do to speed it up. I do perform a trick here called Quick Sword, which just allows me to pick up the sword before the owl leaves the screen, saves a little bit of time. But apart from that, nothing too special. And from this point on, since I'm restricted to no wrong warping, I have to get a couple of items before I can actually break the game and go out of bounds. The first being the feather, which you can actually obtain in the first dungeon in the game. And so I'm just going to head north through the woods here to get the tail key. I guess other things to note about the category while I'm just traveling through the woods here. There is a restriction where you need to defeat bosses in a properly loaded dungeon. It's a little bit weird and complex, but it just keeps the category from being too abused and too short. Trying to keep things interesting, I suppose. So the first thing here, I'm going to pick up this mushroom, which normally you're supposed to trade for the powder in order to get by a raccoon that prevents you from getting the tail key. However, there's a trick here called the Moblin D-Boost, which I can use to get across this pit, which you're not normally supposed to get across. This is actually straightforward, and pretty much the same as a lot of other categories of this speedrun. And you can actually skip this owl text with a frame-perfect input, but I actually missed it there. Saves a little bit of time. And now I'm just going to backtrack to town. Before entering Dungeon 1, I'm actually going to stop by the shop to pick up a couple of items, which I'll need later on. The mushroom I pick up for later on, you'll see why. But otherwise, I'm just going to head to town, pick up the shovel, and also bombs and arrows, which I'll definitely need. Accidentally shield bumped that dog there. So as you know, you can actually steal items from the shopkeeper here. It's a lot faster to steal items and sit through this 20-second or so game over cutscene than it is to find 200 rupees at the beginning of the game. So here's a recently found trick. You can actually open up the save and quit menu when you're talking to the shopkeeper, and it completely cancels all his text and also buys the item. Little neat time saver there. I'm also going to steal the bow because it's also very expensive. Otherwise, I'm just going to head straight to Dungeon 1. I don't need the powder, as I mentioned earlier, so that I don't need to head down to the crane game, which other categories of this game would normally obtain. Now I'm just gonna head to get the feather. Nothing out of the ordinary here. I guess I should talk a little bit about the glitches that are coming up, because things are going to get really complicated really fast. Alright, so first of all, there's a movement tech called wall clipping, where you get Link sort of halfway inside of a wall. And with the wall clip, you can do a variety of things. You can flock clip, you can super jump, among other things. The one we're going to pay attention to right now is the super jump. When you have the feather and your wall clips, you can jump towards a wall and then away from a wall, and it actually gives you extra distance and height. We call this trick a super jump, and it allows us to get on top of ceilings and go out of bounds on top of jumping over areas that we aren't normally supposed to jump over. So that's what you're going to see here at the very beginning. As soon as I get the feather, this is where the game gets really broken really fast. So I'm going to wall jump on top of the ceiling, which you're not supposed to, and then I'm going to go left and down out of bounds. So how out of bounds work is if you transition into a wall, it will zip you downwards, typically downwards, until you are popped out. So I can pop out here to Dungeon 3, and I'm going to basically get the boots, the Pegasus boots, which is the item in Dungeon 3. And obviously the Pegasus boots is the fastest form of movement in this game, so it's nice to get it as early as we can. I'm gonna grab this key here in order to unlock this key block, and I'm gonna perform a trick called flop clipping, which requires a wall clip and using text in order to clip into walls and get past this key block. And that allows us to skip the Dodongos fight, which normally is guarding the Pegasus boots. So this is going to be a little bit weird, but instead of saving and quitting to the beginning of the dungeon, I'm actually going to backtrack through Dungeon 3. And the reason why I have to backtrack through Dungeon 3 as opposed to just saving and quitting to the beginning of Dungeon 3 is because I don't have the power bracelets at this point, and the very first door of Dungeon 3 is actually blocked by... well, you can't actually open the door unless you throw something at it. And since I don't have the Pegasus boots, or the power bracelets rather, I can't throw a pot at it. So dying or saving and quitting will actually soft lock at this point. So neither of those things, I can't do either of those things, otherwise the game will soft lock. Alright, in any event, I grab a couple of keys for a couple of reasons, but we'll see. And I'm gonna go out of bounds here again, doing the same super jump into a screen transition zip to get to Dungeon 4. So, weird thing about out of bounds. Notice how this is Dungeon 4, but it's in Dungeon 3's palette? This means that only Dungeon 3's keys will work on it, not Dungeon 4's keys. So I actually grabbed a small key in Dungeon 3's palette earlier, and I'm gonna use that to unlock this door. We don't like to fight mini-bosses, so we're just gonna skip them by performing a super jump out of this room. And here is the second most broken item in this category, the flippers. The flippers allows us to swim and allows us to perform a trick called super swimming, which, similar to its name in The Wind Waker, it is a very broken trick, and you're going to see it here. Basically what happens is we get a wall clip while in water, and we sort of do a similar inputs to a super jump, and it actually puts us on a lower layer than the standard game. So we can actually just dash through walls and all the objects. Enemies in pits are still... you're still affected by enemies in pits, but everything else you can just kind of go around. You cannot open doors while in the super swim state, but you can still open chests. So I'm going to open the chest there, which contains the D3 boss key, Dungeon 3 boss key. And then I'm going to grab the power bracelets here. This is actually Dungeon 6's power bracelet chest. However, the power bracelet chests in this game are actually the same. So the first chest you open will be the level 1 power bracelet, and the second chest you open will be the level 2 power bracelet. So even though that was the Dungeon 6's power bracelet chests, it was still the level 1 power bracelet. And since we're already out of bounds and in a super swim state, we might as well get the hook shot, because we do need that to beat the Dungeon 5 boss. So I'm actually going to fight Master Stalfos while in Dungeon 3's palette and also in a super swim state, which allows me to just walk through walls and get to all of his necessary fights really quickly. And so Master Stalfos here dies. He has four fights. The first fight requires 3 bombs, the second and third fight requires 2 bombs, and the final fight he dies in 3 bombs and drops the hookshot. You don't necessarily have to do his fights in order, but the third fight doesn't spawn unless the first 2 fights are beaten, and the fourth fight doesn't spawn. Or the fourth Master Salvos doesn't spawn until the first 3 have been defeated. So, I'm just super swimming out of bounds to the necessary areas where he is located. One thing to note about super swimming, you can only go left, right, or up. Oh, I actually failed the quick spin here. If you transition downwards while in the super swim state, the game will actually crash. So I'm just gonna pick up the hook shot here, and then I'm gonna save and quit out. I wait a little bit there because if you save and quit too early, you actually don't get the hook shot. Alright, so now that we have all the necessary items, we're actually just gonna backtrack back to town. Fortunately, since we were in Dungeon 3's palette, it saves and quit. The save and quit puts us back in Dungeon 3, which is actually really close to town, and town is actually the closest place to Deathel in terms of getting out of bounds. And Deathel's final phase requires 16 arrows, so I'm actually going to stop by the shop here and buy some arrows. I'm also going to buy some bombs because you can use bombs to perform a tech skip on the Deathel fight. Alright, we're going to head to the Ocarina Shrine now. Again, a lot of these glitches get really complicated since you do a variety of them all at once, so if my explanations aren't really the most easy to understand, I apologize about that. So we're gonna do a super jump to get to the Ocarina early here, and then we're gonna head down, and we're gonna head right, which we can go because we have the Pegasus boots. And we're actually going to do another super jump here through this wall out of bounds into this area. And then from here, I try to wait for this fish so that he doesn't damage me because 3 hearts is pretty low for Deathel. And then we're going to do a super swim, a really precise super swim, the most precise one probably. And from here we're going to go out of bounds. You can actually use this witch to kind of boost you forward. I'm not sure how this works, but it's pretty neat and it saves a little bit of time. And this is the Deathel fight. And I'm going to save and quit here. And the reason for that is, I mentioned earlier reverse boss ordering having a few restrictions. One of them is you need to fight the bosses. You need to enter the boss room and fight the boss from a properly loaded dungeon palette. So since I entered from out of bounds, I can just save and quit and it reloads the palette correctly. It does require me to backtrack a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. And so here I'm going to drop some bombs in order to get the tech skip. This is the first instance of a bomb trigger, and actually the only instance of a bomb trigger in this category, at the very least. It's very abused in other categories, though. And the reason why I picked up the mushroom earlier is it actually defeats the first phase of Deathel here, if you just hold the mushroom against him. And so this second phase of Deathel is completely RNG, except for the first 2 attacks he throws at you, which you can always reflect back at him. Normally you're supposed to reflect with a sword, but you can actually reflect these balls with the shovel. And so that's a case of bad RNG there, where he doesn't throw an attack I can reflect. So using the shovel is actually really risky because you can't really dodge his... Like, if he gives you an attack you can't reflect, you can't actually dodge it, and at 3 hearts this is actually really dangerous. But since I was on a pace that was behind, I decided to play a little risky, and I actually got really bad RNG. As you can see here, after this fight, I'm left with only 1 heart. And here's a neat little trick where you can stop your momentum with the shovel and take out your sword, and you're just dashing in place, which actually defeats this Moldorm phase quite quickly. I just find it a lot safer to do it that way. And then for the scanner phase, you just dash into him. It's actually really dangerous because I almost got hit twice here, which would have been death. I think fighting Deathel first is one of the most interesting fights, or one of the more interesting fights, because it's very exhilarating, I suppose. The run could live or die at this very moment with 3 hearts. My mashing isn't the best here, so I couldn't get any 4 hits. Oh, I did get one, right there. So obviously at half a heart, I'm definitely gonna die if I get hit. But it went pretty well, as you can see. Apart from the Aghanim phase of the Nightmare fight giving me bad RNG, the rest of the fight went pretty smoothly, I'd say. And as such, I actually saved a decent chunk of time. Alright, so while you thought that the Deathel fight was a close call, it's not over yet, because I actually have to travel back to town with only half a heart. So I have to get through these moblins and a couple of enemies with half a heart. And the reason why I'm going this way to town, as opposed to just backtracking to town the normal route, is because I actually need this portal later on. And detouring for this portal and actually using it to get back into town is only like, I believe it was a 5-second time difference. So it's definitely worth to get the portal now. And this tree always has a fairy if you bonk into it, so as long as you get to the portal, you're pretty safe afterwards. And so we're gonna revisit the Dream Shrine, and we're gonna do a different out of bounds. This one's really precise, but you can actually bonk into this right torch to make it the perfect positioning, which I'm gonna use for safety, because if you aren't in the right position, you can just soft lock, which isn't fun. So I'm going out of bounds here, and I'm going to... I got the Ocarina earlier, which you're not normally... You don't really need it for any bosses. However, after Dungeon 7, you're actually trapped, and it's a soft lock unless you have Mambo's Mambo. So I'm actually going to pick up Mambo's Mambo out of bounds right here. So there's another cool glitch in this game, which I should explain while this cutscene is going on. And it's a very glitched cutscene, as you can see. Fortunately, the music is still intact, because it's a really good song. But in any event, there's a glitch called text gliding, which if you enter an area that has text as soon as you enter from a higher elevated plane, I don't really know exactly how it works, but while you're out of bounds, the Deathel fight, the Mambo Mambo song, and also Frog song, you can get text gliding off of this, and it's this weird glitch where you have a lot of speed and you can also just walk over everything. It's a little bit more restrictive though, because you can't actually cancel this glitch, and you can only cancel this glitch by either saving and quitting or entering a staircase. And I'm gonna grab some items while I have this state though, particularly the power bracelets, which will now be level 2, and then the fire rod. I'm going to enter this staircase nearby, and this actually puts me right in Dungeon 8. After performing a text glide though, the game is pretty glitched and wonky, so I'm just going to save and quit out of here so I can reset all the sprites and such so that the game isn't too bugged. And this is Dungeon 8. Instead of getting the boss key, I'm going to do a lava swim over here, which is just pause buffering and screen transitioning the frame you land on water, which allows you to swim in lava for some reason. And then I'm going to super jump into the boss room, because who needs boss keys? And that is Hothead, the Dungeon 8 boss. So most of the time spent here is actually going out of bounds and getting Mambo's Mambo, as opposed to actually navigating through Dungeon 8. A lot of boss keys are skipped in this category. There's a few that we still obtain, and there's a few funky instances, which you'll see later on. Alright, from here, I'm gonna actually go back to the Dream Shrine again. The Dream Shrine just has a lot of out-of-bounds potential to the late-game dungeons. So the Dream Shrine allows us to get to the Windfish Egg, Dungeon 8 and Dungeon 7. But afterwards, we won't be really visiting the Dream Shrine for a while because it's not very useful outside of the first 3 areas that we need to visit, the endgame at the very least. So Dungeon 7 is probably... Getting to Dungeon 7's boss, the Evil Eagle, is probably the most technical out-of-bounds navigation, and not even just out-of-bounds navigation, but also the tricks you need to perform are also the most technical of all of the segments in this game, I believe. So much like before, I'm going to go out of bounds the same way I went to get to Deathel, but we're going to go a little bit further. So again, I'm going to super jump to the right here and screen position to the right here, which is... this room just has water, which allows us to super swim, and you need water to super swim. I'm going to do this precise super swim, which I actually missed the first time here, and then I missed the wall clip. But I get the super swim here, and I'm going to go... And this is where I'm going to go to Dungeon 7. Again, I'm going to use this witch to boost me forward. It's pretty cool, and I'm going to use it a lot more, as you can kind of see how, like, you pretty much spawn, like, 60% through a screen transition, which is pretty cool. And then I'm going to drop into this pit here, and this pit actually drops me into Dungeon 7. And I'm going to zip downwards, right by the staircase here. Like I mentioned before, when you're in the super swim state, walls may not affect you, but pits still do, so that pit just dragged me into Dungeon 7, because that's just where it normally is supposed to take you. So this super jump is one of the hardest in the normal category. This is the P-Hat super jump, which requires you to sort of use your sword to recoil off a P-Hat and get to this room. This super jump, however, gets a lot more difficult. You're gonna recoil off this blade trap, and then you're gonna shield bonk off of him twice in order to screen transition down to this screen, and this staircase actually takes you to the boss area. That staircase, we don't really know why it exists, but it only exists in the state where the pillars aren't collapsed, and obviously, since we are allowed to go out of bounds in this category, it's a lot faster to just do that as opposed to collapsing the tower by knocking down all the pillars. And so this is the Evil Eagle quick kill. You can only do this in categories that save and quit. I'm not sure why, but it allows you to shoot fire downwards and it kill the Evil Eagle quite quickly. In categories that don't save and quit, you can't perform it. And as I mentioned before, upon exiting this dungeon, the game actually soft locks if you don't have Mambo's Mambo, because you haven't opened the Dungeon 7 with the appropriate dungeon key. The door isn't there, so you sort of just spawn inside of a wall, and you can't actually get out of this wall. And saving and quitting will put you back in the wall, so you can't save and quit out of that wall either. So, the only way out, actually, is to use Mambo's Mambo, as you can see there. And so from here, you're going to see a bit of new areas, since heading to Dungeon 6, we can't head back to the Dream Shrine. As mentioned earlier, I needed to open up the portals to use later. This is the first instance where we'll actually use this portal. And the reason why we use this portal is because there's a cave nearby Dungeon 4, which we can use to get out of bounds. Super swimming is going to be really important in this speedrun to get to a lot of areas. So here's this cave, which normally has a heart container. And you can actually drop down to this cave right after Dungeon 7, so it went really fast to get here, but unfortunately you can't escape from the entrance. And voila, we're in Dungeon 6. So there's a key block in the top right. You can't actually flop clip past it, because you can't get a wall clip, not in the right way, the right manner that allows you to get by this key block. So I'm actually just gonna fool around and get this key here. There's actually a strat to get it a little bit, the key a little bit faster, but I kind of messed it up and it's sort of a chain reaction. And from here, I can just super jump over into the boss room, which is convenient because I can pick up these bombs, which I need for the boss, and also just super jump into the boss. No boss key needed. I have a little cute setup where I jump 4 times in order to time these bomb placings. It's pretty nice. I got blocked by this ocarina in the menu. When menuing with the ocarina is really weird, and it's incredibly frustrating sometimes. Alright, so next we're gonna head to Dungeon 5. Since I already got the hook shot while out of bounds earlier, at the beginning of the game actually, I don't need to get the hook shot, so I can actually just go right to the boss. So from Dungeon 6, I'm going to head east. If I screen transition down here, there's actually owl text, so I'm just gonna head directly right. Skip some owl text, saves a good chunk of time. And I need to go this way anyway. And I'm gonna head over to this far cave, which allows us to get back to the raft minigame area. However, we don't really need to go back to the raft minigame. We just need to use this cave, which has water, which means we can super swim. So I'm gonna super swim off this bottom wall, which I messed up because I didn't have a wall clip. And from here, sprites look really weird because we're in the cave palette. But from here, I'm just gonna get to Dungeon 5. Which seems a little weird and roundabout, and you can get lost, but once you practice enough, you kind of know where you're going. This is actually Dungeon 5, as you can see, and I'm going to enter this staircase here to reload Dungeon 5's palette. So I'm going to use a flock clip to get me a wall clip into this wall, which will allow me to perform a super jump out of this little enclosed area, because I don't have a key block, I actually can't escape. But luckily, I can use a combination of a flock clip and a super jump to escape here. And I'm going to use the hook shot while jumping to get across here. And similar to other areas, you actually don't need the boss key because you can just super jump into the boss room. It's a common theme where they put a 1x1 area right before a boss room, so you can just super jump into it. Quite convenient for a lot of the areas. So there's a strat here that allows us to always defeat Slime Eel in 2 cycles. I actually missed the hookshot here, which is unfortunate, but I did get good RNG. So I managed to defeat the Slime Eel here in just 3 cycles. And this boss is actually the only reason we need the hookshot. So if it wasn't for this boss, we wouldn't actually need to have picked up the hookshot at the beginning of the game. It's unfortunate, but some things must be done for the bosses. You can imagine, because fighting Master Salphos is quite slow since you have to fight him 4 times to get the hookshot. Alright, so there is a cave south of Dungeon 5, which you use to get, I believe, some sort of upgrade. I don't actually remember which upgrade it is. Just to the right here. And I'm actually going to jump into this cave, which I actually failed this jump, so I have to do it again, but I need to just get into this cave. And in this cave, voila, there's water, so we can actually get a super swim here. And from here, we're going to super swim into Dungeon 4, as you can imagine. Some of the out-of-bounds movement is done in a specific manner in order to avoid door lag. So, I didn't mention this before, but when you're entering some rooms, there's a door that locks behind you. That door actually causes a little bit of lag, but by navigating in specific rooms, we can avoid that lag. And so I'm going to pick up the Dungeon 4 boss key here in Dungeon 4's palette, And you don't actually need this boss key in order to get to the boss fight. However, we need the dungeon key for other dungeons. Which may sound weird, but you'll see what I mean in a bit. Because you may be thinking, you got the Dungeon 4 boss key for Dungeon 4, and you're using it for Dungeon 4's boss key, so what use could you possibly have with it? But you'll see when we get to Dungeon 2. You may not remember this because it's been a while, but back when I was getting the hookshot and the first power bracelet, I also picked up Dungeon 3's boss key while out of bounds. So I don't need to pick up Dungeon 3's boss key. The Dungeon 3 boss is actually one of the few bosses that actually requires you to get the boss key. To get the boss key. But since we already got out of bounds, we don't need to get it. And we can just get to him. And we're gonna use this cave again. Except this time we're going left instead of right. And I'm trying to set myself on the lowest pixel here. Because if you aren't on the lowest pixel, then you actually can soft lock. But I accidentally did it over a ceiling tile and fell in, so I lost a little bit of time there, but not too big of a deal. So I'm gonna dash directly left here. And the reason why I need a low pixel is because I'm going to screen transition downwards here, while also getting a zip. And if you are too high, then you can actually just soft lock. And so this out of bound puts us in Dungeon 3, right here. And so we actually skipped the whole chain of key blocks, since we're already just down in this area, which is pretty convenient. We do have to kill these guys, but we would have had to kill them if we went through the key blocks. So here's the Dungeon 3 boss. Unfortunately, I performed quite poorly in this area, in this boss fight. It's quite a mess. So I just lost a bit of time to failing to two-cycle this boss. It was quite the mess, as you can see. And I wasn't sure which one would have dropped the heart piece, so I went with the right one, and I was wrong. Like I always am. Alright, so cool things about Dungeon 2 and Dungeon 1. The method of out of bounds that we're using to get to Dungeon 2 and 1 actually requires the Dungeon 3 boss to be defeated. So if the Dungeon 3 boss wasn't defeated, then we wouldn't actually be able to use this method. Funny enough. So thanks to reverse boss order, we can use this method, and it's actually the fastest method. Fun little thing, I suppose. Fun facts about this route. Of how beneficial it is to defeat the bosses in reverse order. So I'm going to take this warp back over to the Dungeon 4 area. And we're going to use this cave here. I'm going to do a diagonal jump super jump, which looks weird, but it works, and it's really easy to do. To get up on this ceiling. And then I'm going to use this ceiling to get down to this wall. You can actually do an unclip super jump to get to this area, but it's pretty difficult to do. And very time consuming if you don't get it really fast. So we're gonna go through this room down here. This is where the Dungeon 3 boss was, so if we didn't beat the Dungeon 3 boss, we wouldn't have been able to go through this room. And so now we're back in Dungeon 4. Which seems odd since we've already beat the boss here, but we're going to use out of bounds super swim movement in order to get to Dungeon 3, or Dungeon 2 rather. Now, like I mentioned before, I got the Dungeon 2 boss key, or the Dungeon 4 boss key already, and since this is Dungeon 4's palette, it actually works on all boss doors that are in this palette. So this is Dungeon 2, but it's in Dungeon 4's palette. But since it's in Dungeon 4's palette, we can still use the Dungeon 4 boss key, and boss doors actually stay unlocked despite switching palettes. So I'm going to switch back to D2, and we're going to fight the Dungeon 2 boss. This fight is actually identical to how you would normally fight it. A genie quick kill, we call it. It's a bit slow, but I'm going to pick him up while stabbing him to skip his decks. I'm going to get a wall clip and throw him against this wall to break the pot instantly. I'm going to place a couple of bombs in order to kill him very quickly. So, there's only one boss left, which is Moldorm. We thought about how to get to Moldorm for a while. There's many ways you can get to Moldorm, since we've already unlocked the Dungeon 1. The Dungeon 1. We've already entered Dungeon 1 before, so we can just re-enter it and finish the dungeon the same way that a normal any % run would. However, we found that it was a bit faster to go to Dungeon 1 via Out of Bounds, because you can skip obtaining a couple of small keys that you normally would have had to obtain if you went through the any % route. So I'm gonna head through this cave again, and similarly do the same out of bounds movement I did earlier. This is the fastest way to get to Dungeon 4. Without, you know, unlocking Dungeon 4, since we don't have Dungeon 4 unlocked. We can't get to Dungeon 4 any really other way. Well, there's a few ways you get to Dungeon 4, but this is one of the faster ways to get to Dungeon 4. Just because of how close the cave is to where we exit Dungeon 2 and Dungeon 1. And similarly, reloading the pallet the same way. And getting a super swim off of this wall the same way. And so, Dungeon 2 was on the right, and coincidentally, Dungeon 1 is just to the left. Voila. Here's where Moldorm lies, and since we have Dungeon 4's palette, we can use Dungeon 4's key to open Dungeon 1's door. So the Dungeon 4 boss key, as you can imagine, has a lot of use. And so I'm going to do a quick spin here to beat Moldorm in 3 phases. Unfortunately, I bonked off of his tail and fell in the pit. But it's a minor time loss, and I'm going to do the 3 cycle again here. The quick spin isn't too difficult, but sometimes it's RNG dependent. So from here, we just need to get back to the Dream Shrine and use the Dream Shrine out of bounds movement in order to get Deathel. And we will fight Deathel to get to the final boss. We'll use the Dream Shrine to get to the final boss once again. And so, backtracking from Dungeon 1 back to town is actually pretty fast. So you may be asking why I decided to use Mambo's Mambo to warp all the way to the overworld and get back to town. Interestingly enough, it ends up being faster to Mambo and go back to town from around this area than it is to backtrack to town from Dungeon 1. And the only reason for that is because there's owl text upon exiting the Dungeon 1 area, and that owl text is really long. It's really, really long, and it makes it slower than navigating this way. There's also the kids who tell you that Bow Wow has been kidnapped. I mean, that text isn't that long. It's really the owl text that's really long. And I actually don't have enough arrows to fight Deathel because I only had, like, I believe 14, so I'm just gonna buy some arrows here as a nice... it's also a nice safety precaution to get arrows there. And so from here until the end of the game, the out of bounds movement is actually the same to get to Deathel the first time we got to Deathel. It's just the fastest way to get to Deathel. I mean, there are other ways. There's a lot of other ways to get Duffel, but this is the fastest way, given that we have flippers to super swim with. If we didn't, then we'd probably have to navigate a different way. And again, I'm gonna drop bombs to try to skip the text, which I get. I also use up the rest of my bombs, but luckily we don't need them anymore, because it's the final boss. And once again, you defeat Deathel right away if you hold the mushroom against him, his Zol phase. And so the second time around, this fight is really not risky anymore. Honestly, there's almost a 0% chance a 0% chance that I can die here, just because you have just so many hearts. Especially if you've practiced fighting this guy with 3 hearts, having how many hearts here? Like 11 hearts makes this fight really easy and not very threatening. So I got one unreflectable ball here, but apart from that, that's pretty good RNG. Better than average. I believe my RNG here wasn't actually that great, but it's just time. A little bit of time. It's not the most amount of time. Also, my mashing is slow. Yeah, I got really weird RNG where he kept on like opening his eye when the arms were in front of his body, which made it really annoying to try to get shots in. As you can see, I'm taking so much damage, but I'm not really in any fear of dying. And that is Link's Awakening DX Reverse Boss Order. Once we enter the staircase here, it'll just play out the credits in the final cutscenes. With the final time of 42:31. Not the worst time. It's not bad. 41 is definitely easily possible. You do have to grind for RNG a little bit because you have to fight Deathel 2 times, and just the first time you fight Deathel, you can cost up to 45 seconds or more. So if you consider you have to fight him twice, he can be really annoying time-wise. It wasn't a perfect run. There was a little bit of slop here and there, but overall I think I navigated without losing too much time. A lot of work was spent optimizing the movement. Not really the movement, but the routing. Like how to get to this boss or how to get to this boss the quickest way possible. Probably hundreds of hours in timing and testing. So in terms of the route I used, I feel pretty content with this route being one of the fastest routes, if not the fastest route. At least until we find new out-of-bounds movement that we don't know about. That could be helpful, but otherwise I think this route is pretty good. There's not much else to say. I can give out my shoutouts and thank yous to the actual GDQ event if this game gets in, but for now, I'll submit this game, and if it gets in, then I'll definitely be making sure I keep myself practicing it. I do a lot of really risky things early on in this run, and the reason for that is because I want to save time. Obviously, in a marathon setting, there's a lot of safety strats I could do. There is a super potion or whatever it's called that I can get, which gives me a whole another set of hearts, which I can bring for the Deathel fight first time around. I don't really save a lot in this run. Actually, you don't really save at all after you get past Dungeon 8. So, obviously I could save a lot more often to prevent crashes or soft locks from ruining my run. Those are really scary if those happen. I think the scariest thing in this run, in terms of marathon setting, will be the Deathel fight, the first one where you have 3 hearts, which I'll probably just get the super potion for, to have 6 hearts, essentially. And the only other scary thing would be getting the hook shot, because anytime from the moment you jump out of bounds in Dungeon 1 till the time you get the power bracelets, if you die or save and quit, then that's a soft lock. So that's pretty scary too. But it's honestly not very... It's very hard to avoid soft locking, so I'm not too afraid of soft locking there, but it can happen. I think Reverse Boss Order is a really cool demonstration category. There's a lot of really cool things in the category. A lot of the out of bounds movement is unique to this category. A lot of tricks are unique to this category. So I think it can be a really cool showcase at a GDQ. And well, fighting the final boss with 3 hearts is really fun to watch, I suppose. Keeps you at the edge of your seat. Even though you can actually play it quite safe. You can play a lot of things safe, so. It's a cool category with a lot of risky and cool things to watch, while also not being something that is too risky for a marathon setting. So this is definitely one of the games I'd love to submit to GDQ. There's not much else to say here, so I'm just gonna let the credits play out. Thank you for watching, guys, and best of luck to me and everyone else who's submitting a game to GDQ. Even if my games don't get into GDQ, I still plan on going, so I hope to see you guys there. Alright, I'm just gonna let the rest of the credits play out. I'm gonna mute my mic, and I'm just gonna cut stream when the credits end. Thanks for watching.